John Byrne with AML Rights Source. And today we are covering an issue because there's such a crucial time in the U.S. AML environment because, on the one hand, the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, has begun their mutual evaluation of the U.S. And one of the key aspects of that is looking at how laws and regulations that the financial sector in the U.S. have to comply with, how they might inadvertently impact issues regarding humanitarian groups, charities, NPOs, in terms of their ability to get financial access that is so important for a whole host of reasons, including getting both medical supplies and utilities and finances into conflict zones and other areas. So one of the key things we want to accomplish with this conversation is to hear from the experts in that space, some of the things that are problematic, and also what can be done besides, in general, letting the evaluators know of these issues, which they've already heard from a number of these folks already, but to try to get both some practical issues, some operational issues. And so really pleased to have this group with me today. So with me today are representatives from the Charity and Security Network. We have Praviko Mehra, here, and we've talked to her on a number of occasions. Sarah Gardner, who's also with the Charity and Security Network. Kurt Herberson is with a group called EarthRights International. And Rachel Freed, and I hope I'll get this right, Rachel, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. So she's joining us as well. So I want to thank all of you for your time today. And why don't we just jump into this and start with a description of the mutual evaluation process, recommendation 8s, and some of the issues from the Charity and Security Network standpoint, which I should say, I guess, why don't we jump back a little bit? Pravika, if you wouldn't mind explaining to the audience, and we've interviewed a number of folks before, your colleague Ashley and some others, if you wouldn't mind explaining the mission statement of the Charity and Security Network, and then let's talk about the evaluation process.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, John, for having us on here today, and happy to dive into describing Charity and Security Network, or CSN's mission. CSN was founded in the wake of 9/11 to protect the operating environment of civil society, as it also relates to their financial freedom and their right to operate with NPO financing and financial inclusion. The most important thing about our mission, I think, to note for the purposes of this podcast are that we're not opposed to counterterrorism financing regulations. I think they're important. They keep society safe. It's important to have them insofar as you also have humanitarian, human rights, and peace building carve-outs baked into that. And that's something that we work on and have worked on for decades, and is very near and dear to our heart, and something that we work on to serve our fellow civil society organizations as well. And yeah, happy to also talk about the Financial Action Task Force and mutual evaluation. So the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF, is the global standard setter for policies aimed at combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism, or AML-CFT, through its 40 recommendations and 11 immediate outcomes. Together, this forms the FATF standards. Today, the FATF's influence extends to about 200 jurisdictions that have committed to implementing these FATF standards. And while the FATF itself is considered soft law, its standards are considered soft law, its recommendations shape national regulatory systems, banking compliance practices, and international financial cooperation. Again, as a lot of compliance folks would be familiar with, a key mechanism through which FATF exercises this influence is through the mutual evaluation process. During these evaluations, independent assessment teams come to the country that is being evaluated and review whether it has adopted and effectively implemented FATF standards. Poor performance, specifically on the mutual evaluation, can carry serious economic consequences, including heightened scrutiny from financial institutions, reduced foreign investment, reputational damage associated with FATF's gray or blacklisting process of jurisdictions under increased monitoring, and so on and so forth. So it's an important process, right? And for nonprofit organizations specifically, and linking back to our mission, one recommendation is particularly significant, and that is out of the 40, that is recommendation 8. Historically, this recommendation has led to increased de-risking for the nonprofit sector when it was created in the wake of 9/11. But after two revisions to recommendations 8, first in 2016 and 2023, and I'm also happy to say that NPOs were nonprofit organizations were very involved in getting those changes made. In fact, it has worked with nonprofit organizations to get those changes through. It now requires governments to apply what is called a risk-based approach instead of a zero-risk approach when protecting the sector from terrorist financing abuse. Crucially, FATF has clarified in its 2016 revision specifically that nonprofits are not particularly vulnerable to terrorist financing, which is to dispel the previous narrative that the sector is inherently high risk or punitive, and it should be under punitive enforcement measures, which can actually cause serious harm, including delays to humanitarian assistance and disruptions to legitimate civil society activity, which is incredibly concerning to our organization's mission and vision, but also to all the organizations we serve. Coming up to specifically the mutual evaluation. So the US has its mutual evaluation coming up, and therefore this podcast is kind of happening at this critical moment. Amid growing pressures on nonprofit organizations, both domestically and internationally, including through the use of expanded terrorism designations, the weaponization of CFT measures in the US against nonprofit organizations, and this heightened scrutiny of civil society actors, the evaluation provides a really rare but crucial multilateral opportunity to assess whether US AML-CFT regulations remain consistent with FATF's risk-based approach under Recommendation 8. For nonprofits, the process offers a very important platform to document how financial regulation affects their work and to ensure that measures intended to protect financial integrity don't ultimately end up undermining legitimate civil society activity as required by FATF. So, yeah, I hope that that's a good overview of Recommendation 8 in FATF.
Let me just add that I was around on 9/11, worked for the American Bankers Association, and right after that, we worked very closely with law enforcement, the FBI, and others to have banks work with transactional information and other things. And then, of course, the Patriot Act was passed, and as you mentioned, your organization was sort of a response to that. I will say at the time, it was clear from this was a 300-page piece of legislation that passed in less than 3 weeks. You can kind of imagine what the environment was at the time, but unless you were in the middle of it, it's probably hard to, I don't say appreciate, but understand. But here was the thing. We were told, meaning the financial sector at the time, that there had been some, they felt, meaning law enforcement, clear examples where charities, maybe not intentionally, but were involved in the movement of illicit funds that helped commit the heinous acts. Now, that was sort of the premise that the financial sector was given. So as you can imagine, the response was, there was a couple of responses: the filing of suspicious activity reports, certainly the exiting of relationships or not the onboarding of relationships, fearing that even with what we have now as a risk-based approach, the fear that if a bank was going to manage those accounts, even if they were capable of managing those, the regulators would not have approved. So it took a long time for that to work its way through the environment, the way the communities were impacted. And so that's why your organization was created. But again, for almost a decade and a half, even though you would hear regulators say, we don't believe all charities are created the same, it didn't always translate into the one-on-one conversations between an examiner and a financial institution. That's why it was so important that we, meaning the broad stakeholders, including yourself, made the case that this isn't working. So long-winded way of saying Recommendation 8 is also part of that, right? Because that, again, was a response early on to what happened at 9/11. So I think that hopefully adds a little more context from the financial sector to what you pointed out very clearly. So let's go and go to Sarah now. Sarah, there was a shadow report created or released late December. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? And then there was also a joint letter that you guys put together to the state attorneys general. Talk a bit about that and where we are today in early March as we record this.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, and thanks for that really helpful background, and and what the environment was like in the years immediately after 9/11. I think what we're seeing today is a lot of those those worst practices that you've outlined, really kind of manifesting and being kind of ratcheted up and towards new targets. So as you said, the Charity and Security Network submitted a shadow report to the Financial Action Task Force at the end of last year, highlighting some of our specific concerns around the US's adherence to Recommendation 8 and adoption of a risk-based approach. And I won't detail them all here because I understand we'll be having a separate conversation about the shadow report, but these concerns included threats to nonprofit tax-exempt status, kind of limitations on nonprofit access to funding, increased rhetoric from senior government officials depicting nonprofits as agents of domestic terrorism, and weaponization of existing regulatory frameworks, including AML and CFT frameworks, to target and silence civil society actors. These worrying trends have really continued through, we're almost at the end of the first quarter of 2026. And I think this very well exemplified by a joint letter in mid-February that was sent out by 19 states' attorneys generals to the Department of Justice, calling for investigation into over 150 civil society actors focused on issues related to environmental and climate justice for potential violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. We're also continuing to await clearer interpretations and implementing guidance for a series of executive orders and directives that were put out towards the end of the last year, particularly as they relate to National Security Presidential Memo 7, which this memo directs federal, state, and local law enforcement officials to launch sweeping investigations into nonprofit finance and activities, and potentially to consider criminal charges against nonprofit leaders on the basis of domestic terrorism. And the definition of domestic terrorism that's adopted in what we've seen so far is extremely, extremely broad and risks both criminalizing and legally protected speech. And I think is also contributing to an environment of just like a lot of fear and uncertainty. And as we've seen around the world, that can lead to a chilling effect and ultimately to the detriment of the communities that nonprofits serve, can lead to delays in delivery of services. So we'll leave it there because I want to leave some space for our colleagues to go into more detail about the impacts to their specific communities.
Yeah, so let's turn to that, and I'll stay with you, Sarah and Porvika, for a moment, and then we want to hear directly from Kirk and Rachel about the impacts. But let's talk about. I hate the word weaponization now because it's been so misused. But clearly, in the AML-CFT space, obviously coming from the financial sector, part of the response of my colleagues has been confusion. We need certainty. We need better communication, which we've talked about with potential and current clients. So that becomes really important. But given this, talk a bit about, besides what you've already mentioned, the impact on the nonprofit sector, because what we've heard, and again, not anecdotally, but very specifically, I think Charity Security Network has actually done some reports on this. Interaction has done some things. I've talked to those folks as well. So there are statistics about loss of financial access. Even if this is the one, this is an anecdote, but very, very relevant. When we started doing these meetings that I referenced a few years ago, I vividly remember somebody that was involved with a Syrian relief fund. And what they said was, in some cases, we're still getting financial services, but because of some of the hurdles that banks feel they have to overcome, there's delays in distributing these funds, and those delays can affect what we said up front, right? Medical supplies, water, utilities. And he sort of stopped and said, and people die. So obviously that's a very clear thing. But let's talk a bit about some of the other issues that affect nonprofits when you can't get access, or you do get access and there are delays. The payment system or what have you. So I throw it open to the group. Let's talk about some of those things.
Perfect. Okay, I'm happy to provide a slightly general overview of those impacts before we give it to Rachel and Kirk to talk about the specifics based on their sectoral experience. The CSN had a report back in 2017 on financial access in the US for domestic nonprofit organizations, many of whom also, take part in cross-border transfers. And what we found was 2/3 of domestic US nonprofit organizations have faced some form of de-risking, right? That can range anywhere from what you just outlined, which is, payment delays, payment denials, some of these, inconveniences, which are significant inconveniences. And then it can come to something as extreme as, asset freezes with a very short turnaround to comply, or debanking altogether. And that debanking and de-risking, you mentioned Syria's example, and it's great because we've noticed that it is, there are high risk jurisdictions that aren't, kind of verbalized as high risk, but are considered high risk. And also there is a certain level of um, an element of religion-based de-risking. So, we've seen a lot of our Muslim majority partners go through this at a very exponentially higher degree than other partners have historically. So they've seen this for years and years before the current environment. And I'm also happy you asked this question because it helps us kind of found this conversation in the fact that we're seeing this exponential rise in the use of executive orders and the use of, all of these targeted measures at civil society, the IRS's weaponization, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Geographic targeting orders by FinCEN to NGOs, right? In Minnesota, we're seeing these, but they're not new. They didn't fall out of nowhere. They came from this decades-old infrastructure that has existed for a long time. You mentioned Syria, and I mean, you've seen partners for a long time who were simply de-risked because they had the country's name in their title, right? So it was, the Syrian Relief Fund, for example, and they had to, just changing their name got that transaction through a lot quicker. But it's flags like this. So there's just a very low level of tolerance for any kind of risk, even if it is a legitimate payment, a legitimate, operational need. And as you noted correctly, John, it leads to, a heavy operational burden, one, compliance burden, compliance costs for NPOs, within their finances, but also delays in, operational relief that can be provided so much quicker and so much more efficiently if there was a more seamless and transparent system for some of these things, especially with banking partners, with regulators, with treasury, many things. But yeah, I think that's from my perspective kind of the lay of the land for the risks we've faced institutionally.
All right, so let's go to go ahead. I'm sorry, go Sarah.
Well, we'll just add really quickly in addition to all of Porvica's excellent points, and we've been hearing from partners throughout the US of needing to invest more in overhead costs for compliance with regulations that are not necessarily grounded or are not grounded in a risk-based approach. So when you think about what that represents in terms of an opportunity cost of nonprofits with limited resources, it's could be hundreds of thousands of dollars towards regulations that are not really serving the public interest, to the detriment of what that money could be spent on for services for vulnerable communities.
That's a great point. All right, let's go to two specific areas in the nonprofit world. Kirk Herbertson is with the group EarthRights International, and I know you spend time paying attention to our world, the financial side. Talk a bit about the real impacts to the organizations and the issues that you cover based on financial institutions' reaction to whatever they believe the AML-CFT laws and regulations require.
Sure. Thanks, John. So EarthRights International is a US-based organization, but we work internationally and within the United States on environmental and human rights issues. And so as part of our work, we're working with a broad range of environmental advocates. So big nonprofits, small nonprofits, community groups, concerned citizens, scientists, lawyers, and others. And just as a quick background context from the environmental community, so globally, environmental advocates face some of the highest levels of violence of any members of civil society. So each year around the world, hundreds are killed and thousands are facing different types of criminalization attacks. Fortunately, in the US, there's not as many assassinations of environmental advocates as in other places, but in the US, there is a long-standing history, particularly in the last decade or so, of these types of criminalization attacks that are happening against environmental advocates, particularly linked to those who are critics of the fossil fuel industry, the oil, gas, and mining sectors. So one thing I did want to say is that the attacks that our sector is facing right now are not new, but there are definitely growing attempts right now to mischaracterize legitimate environmental advocacy as if it is criminal activity. So as Sarah highlighted, we're broadly across the sector, we're experiencing a lot of these types of threats. It all often is linked, even with the banking and anti-money laundering and terrorist financing type attacks, they're often linked to smear campaigns. So environmentalists, you'll see, can be labeled as eco-terrorists. We're often facing accusations of being members of a criminal network, being foreign agents, terrorists more broadly. And what we've really seen in the past year is that there's it's affected the sector more broadly, but there's a particular focus on climate change advocacy. And then so we've seen that with the use of FARA, with the state attorney's general letter that Sarah mentioned, with congressional investigations, with different threats and suggestions about revoking nonprofit 501c3 status and so forth. And then the angles that we see, I just highlight quickly 3 angles that are being used to justify these types of attacks. So one that we're seeing is there are attempts to link nonprofit activities, especially climate change related activities, to China, and to say that these organizations are acting as agents of the Chinese Communist Party. A second one that's much broader is foreign funding in general, and that's again another foreign agents angle. And then the third one that we're also seeing happen, especially domestically, is that there's a range of environmental groups and nonprofits that do a range of things. Some are involved in protests, protest against an oil and gas pipeline or something like that. And at protests, sometimes there's civil disobedience that actually takes place. And civil disobedience can involve intentionally breaking the law in a nonviolent misdemeanor way. So it might be trespassing or blocking traffic. And those types of misdemeanor crimes are being recharacterized as felonies, and in some cases even as terrorism. And then there's been an active push at both the state and federal level to punish those activities as if they are terrorist type activities.
Do they pass laws to do that, or is it does the prosecutor have the ability to do that, or are these states actually passing laws to do what you just suggest, or you just discussed?
Yes. So as of now, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's almost half of U.S. states have passed. They're often called critical infrastructure laws, and so they impose disproportionately harsh penalties on protest activities. So we're seeing that a lot. We have seen a few incidents where there's a criminal prosecution that happens, and then there's a terrorist enhancement that's added onto it as well. So it happens along different stages of the process.
All right, we come back to all of you and ask, what are next steps? What do we do about all this? Because I think that's pretty important. So Rachel, let's go to you. The impact on faith-based organizations, which is obviously a critical part of the NPO community as well.
Thanks, John, and thanks all for hosting this conversation today. The Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, also known as UUSC, is also a global human rights organization. We work in complex humanitarian crisis settings, and we also work to support human rights defenders and address the rights of communities being displaced by climate change and conflict. We also work here in the United States with Unitarian Universalist faith communities that are organizing, protesting, and supporting local action, working with local nonprofits at the local, state, and national level. And the importance of faith communities in human rights work is really critical. You might have seen this recently at in Minnesota, where there was large faith groups organizing in the wake of the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement's crackdowns. And so we've been kind of tracking what's happening. We participate in a few coalitions that kind of track how the philanthropic sector and nonprofit organizations can be better organized together when some of these sort of attacks on our civil society rights are happening. And two of those groups are the Human Rights Funders Network Better Preparedness Initiative, which works across 400 or so human rights organizations, making sure that we understand lawfare, bank de-risking, all of the different things that we're facing. And we've seen, the deployment, these investigations from the state or the DOJ, the congressional charges, it's coming quickly and in multiple ways for various reasons. And we also participate in the Solidaire Network's Block and Build Funder Coalition, which is also, once again, trying to build collective actions so that our industry itself can really protect our rights. It became a little more personal in recent weeks when UUSC received a request for the names of our donors who give over $5,000 and a list of requests for our volunteers. And we had no indication of where this request had came from and why. And so it's interesting because we've been for the last year and a half, listening to really important conversations, tracking nonprofit developments, working in these coalitions to understand and be prepared for all the ways that our organization might be at risk by our government. And yet we were still somewhat not prepared for this. And it was surprising. We bank at Citizens Bank, and they did not supply any information to us. Our vice president of our finance tried to reach the bank several times, and our account manager did not respond. And then we were told our accounts would be frozen within 14 days if we did not comply. And so this was, we had to quickly move into action, and our lawyers escalated it to the general counsel's office, and our case was assigned to the deputy general counsel. And so through that, we're able to resolve the issue for now. They have said our banks will not be frozen, and the general counsel has no idea why we received this notice. And we have now reached out again asking for information about why we were asked to request this information, and we've received no response and indication for any of that. So, this has been our experience. And I think one of the things I will say is that, we need a robust civil society. It's critical for democracy. And one of the themes I've been sort of grappling over in our sector is just how much money is being spent by small nonprofits like ours for compliance, right? We've always complied, but now we're having to ensure that we have a team of lawyers ready to, review everything that we do. And it really gets away from our critical missions of supporting the humanitarian aid and civil societies on the ground. And it's such a level of intensity that many organizations don't even have the resources. We're lucky that we're in philanthropy, so we actually have resources. And so one of the things that I think is really critical is there's been a lot of focus on lawfare as the issue, being concerned about these regulations, but I think there's been less sort of conversation among philanthropy and among nonprofits around the fact that this is more subtle we're being targeted more subtly, right? It's the de-risking comes quietly and subtly. And there's not a lot of conversation that can, you have to be able to escalate your case, I think, to be able to stop the issue from furthering. So I think that's an important thing for us to consider. It's just how is the sector ensuring that they're sharing best practices, understanding how these targets this bank targets are coming in and where that's coming from.
I'm just confused as to why, I guess you didn't find out, why the bank wanted volunteers and donor information, because the opposite is occurring at the federal level in terms of corporate transparency. They've eliminated the requirements under the Corporate Transparency Act, as some of our friends in the FACT Coalition and other places know. So clearly this was, like you say, a one-off. That wasn't a situation where, at least to my knowledge, it came from their regulator or someplace else. But again, you don't know. You folks asked, and then they just said we're not freezing the assets, right?
Yeah, we of course did not supply We're not
Sure.
going to send them the list of our donors. That's confidential for us. And or a list of our volunteers, and or even, I mean, how do you define volunteers, for an organization like ours, which works through faith communities, and faith communities will show up at actions, but they're not, necessarily acting upon the USC's directive. So it's just that we did not comply, of course. And yet when we asked over and over again through emails, through our general counsels, now had 3 different phone calls, we've been given no explanation for why. So that's, the timing is interesting, right? Of it being in February and the work I was describing, we've been engaged with, but there's so much, there are, human rights work under this administration. I think there's many ways that this could have, there's many potential things they wouldn't like. So, but everything's in complete compliance. So.
We should definitely have additional conversations. So I want to do a round robin as we close this off. But obviously the key here, and add to my comments, is we want to make sure the mutual evaluators of the U.S. understand this particular area of focus. I know others are going to be sitting down with them and talking about what I just mentioned, the Corporate Transparency Act, and some of the other issues when they evaluate the U.S.'s compliance with the FATF recommendations, because they have to show both compliance and effectiveness. That's another part of the oversight as these evaluations occur. But I want to ask each of you, besides what you've already mentioned, what are some takeaways for everybody listening, particularly those in the AML-CFT world? What more would you expect from them other than clearly to have better communication with all of your organizations? I mean, I think that's well stated. That has to happen. But let's just go around each of you as we close this out. Rachel, I think you made the case. We have to have better communication. But any other takeaways you want to outline?
I just think that understanding the work of the organization. I mean, much of that work is spelled out on all their Form 990s that are on the website. I mean, that's really critical, right? And it doesn't even seem sometimes like those have been reviewed. So. That's an important thing, understand the organizations.
Right. Kirk, your thoughts?
Yeah, Rachel, I think that's a really good point, especially that's the same for the environmental community, just understanding the different language that different sectors operate in. I would also say that it's important to understand that a lot of the targeting that we're seeing here, it's very similar to what we also see in the US with SLAPP lawsuits, retaliatory lawsuits that are filed in which the goal is not necessarily to win the case, but to drag someone through this really burdensome process that in itself is a form of punishment. And I think that there's a risk of this happening here as well, where just the being subjected to all the uncertainty of these processes can put in a tremendous burden on nonprofits and their funders, and also do tremendous damage. So I think there's a heightened due diligence that's needed.
Sarah, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just emphasize that we're really looking forward to what we hope will be a robust mutual evaluation report for the United States, and also just to try to end on a note of a little bit of hope. As Kirk and other colleagues have been sharing, these dynamics are not new. We've been seeing this play out around the world, and I think we can take a lot of inspiration and hope from the work of civil society and human rights defenders that have been continuing to do really valuable work in defense of fundamental rights and freedoms under immense pressure. So we don't have to reinvent the response or the playbook. We've seen it, kind of played out around the world, and we can draw a lot of inspiration from the work of our colleagues globally.
Thank you for that. Final thoughts, Parvika?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, plus one to what everybody here has said. I think the only thing I would add is for compliance folks who are listening, the environment we're living in, with the advent of AI, but also looser regulation around and more lawfare, right, is that nonprofits are currently extremely prone to disinformation attacks, right? So when we're talking about compliance and we're talking about, researching the nonprofit whose payment is happening, let's be aware of the possibility of that happening. Let's be, robust in how we understand the client's mission and vision, kind of how Rachel and Kirk said, but being aware that, if we see information online, it may not always be accurate. So there is a level of understanding of the current landscape that we're in that's required, just so we can maintain free and fair financial access inclusion for the sector at large.
I will say we will make sure we put links to all of your organizations in the show notes to this conversation. And I will say, having been in the banking industry, either directly or adjacent to for 4 decades, part of the banking mission has always been to work with their communities, whether it's through loans, whether it's through investment. That's always been the case. And there's a lot of excellent examples of financial institutions of all sizes working within their communities. This is a clear example where that can be done through either advocacy or, as we talked about, better communication with current clients that you have that may be in this space, or clients that are approaching you to get financial access. So this debate will continue, but I want to thank this group so much for taking the time today. It's really important that we continue these conversations, and really appreciate what you all are doing. Thank you for what you do, and we'll keep going here. So thanks, everybody.